Progress, the Austrian flag. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's, of course, a very ambitious goal to analyze in 20 minutes why the walls in Europe fell and what we can learn from this. I do not want to give you a learned lecture. There are numerous books written about this. And since we are coming together today on the 9th of November, the day where the wall separating Germany came down, the day, but also the day where the Jewish synagogues burned years ago also, I think this is the right time now today, since the discussion is omnipresent. We see the pictures of hundreds of thousands peaceful demonstrating people, which really on 9th of November made the wall in Berlin come down. But there were, of course, not only the walls in Germany, but there was the Iron Curtain, which ran down from Finland in the north right to the Mediterranean, separating east from west. I come from a country, Austria, where the Iron Curtain, when you were on a lucid day on the church tower of St. Steve in Vienna, you could see the Iron Curtain 50 miles away. So that is not only, what we are discussing is not only a development of Germany, but of Europe. And there are European lessons to draw. Why have I chosen this subject? Because there is an internal discussion going on in Germany, where one side says the reason for the end of communism and real existing socialism in Europe was that the people demonstrated peacefully and that there were not hundreds but hundreds of thousands who demonstrated, and that this, that like the trumpets of Jericho, where the sound of the trumpets made the walls come down, the hundreds of thousands of demonstrators made the walls come down. Helmut Kohl, the legendary, one has to say, legendary Chancellor of Germany, who was the father of the reunification, he held another opinion. He said it was not the demonstrations, but in practice, the GDR was bankrupt. And it was the economic situation, and this applied not only for the GDR, which was one of the most successful countries within the Comecon, the integrated organization of economy in the Warsaw Pact countries. Also, other countries were practically in a very, very bad economic shape. So, was it the people or was it the economy? A question which is always a very essential question in political philosophy. And this is why I choose that subject, because in my criminal record, which was read by the chairman of the session, what I did before I was here, it wasn't mentioned that I was the secretary of the European Democrat Union. That was the equivalent of the Socialist International on the side of the conservative and Christian democratic parties. 1978, it was created. In Austria, members were the party of Margaret Thatcher, of Helmut Kohl, the Gaullists, the Christian Democrats in Italy, in Belgium, in the Netherlands. So a federation of Christian democratic and conservative parties. And I was the secretary to that organization. And one of our objectives was to help the emerging democratic parties in the Middle Europe, Central European and Eastern European countries, which were still under communism, to develop. We helped political leaders, we helped political parties, we supported Lech Wałęsa in Poland with money. We supported parties with facsimile machines. We invited them, we sent them the books they wanted, and so on. So I was in many, many missions over from the Kremlin to the toughest of all countries was the German Democratic Republic. And what I present you now is the essence of my experiences in those crucial years from 1978, when we had created that international, until the wall fell. And what were, in my opinion, the principal reasons for that victory of freedom? First, I think we should not forget that in 1970 already, there was the Charter of Helsinki, there was the Helsinki Act of freedom and cooperation in Europe, which was in the philosophy of the French politicians, détente, entente, coopération, so a way to overcome the division of Europe by détente and then cooperation. And the first act of this, in German it's Entspannung, the first act was in 1970, the Helsinki Act, where all the European countries from West and East came together, agreed on a charter. In that charter, they enshrined the freedom of information. And one of the consequences of that Helsinki Act was freedom of information. Radios were no longer jammed. People could listen, Free Europe could listen BBC. People could, in particular, see TV. And that was of an overall importance because the inhabitants of the countries within the Warsaw Pact, many of them, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Hungarians, Yugoslavia is a special case, but also there, they could watch free TV and they could listen free radio. And there was no longer a monopoly of information from the side of the communist governments. And this created in all these countries freedom movements. Václav Havel in Prague, for example, one of the famous activists of the Helsinki Principles of 1970. And this created strengths of citizens to organize themselves around this charter, which had been signed by the Soviet Union and therefore could not be held against them. So this development on for freedom, signed by both sides, was one of the cornerstones of the 20 years later becoming free of Europe. Secondly, I think we should not forget the media situation as such. The media, which were of overwhelming importance, in particular when the TV became of such a big importance, so that people could see how the West lived. You should not forget that Nikita Khrushchev, the successor of Stalin, 1960, an Ukrainian, very jovial, very jocular. He liked good drink, he liked good jokes. He had an outgoing policy, and he declared that by the end of the century, by the end of the 20th century, real existing socialism would have overtaken market economies in the West. The West would be inferior, socialism would win. That was Nikita Khrushchev. And over the media, people realized how Western people lived, had cars, had jobs, had social security, and in particular, had freedom to criticize and to say what they wanted. And that they saw in TV. And in the East, they saw that the economy declined, and in particular, in the years after 70, the price of crude oil came down. When the wall fell, there was a very low price. So the economies which were based on that Gazprom economy, for example, they had a crisis. And people realized in the socialist countries that they did not enjoy the same standard of living as did the free West. And so the superiority of the social market economy was shown to them every day. So first, the Helsinki principles, freedom. Secondly, the media about information. Thirdly, the battle of the two economic systems, which was clearly won by the free principles of the West. And I say not free market economy, I say socially oriented market economy. That is what we have in Europe. The market has a framework, and that framework is social security, free education, protection against unemployment, and so on. So it's an important difference. But this system, that European system, that won. The fourth factor which I want to mention is that you should realize that in the late 70s, Brezhnev, who was then the dictator of the Soviet Union, he acted according to the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine meant that the Soviet Union could intervene in every country with military force in order to defend the sitting government, communist government, against counter-revolution. And under this Brezhnev Doctrine, for example, Russians intervened in Czechoslovakia in 1968. At the end of the 70s, this Brezhnev communism, made important progress in Africa, Nicaragua, Central America, and one had the impression in Europe that the West was sitting there and watching how Soviet communism took power all over the world. And there was one very important decision on the military field in Europe, where the East tested the will of defense of the West. That was the so-called deployment of missiles, of the SS-20 missiles, where the Soviet Union decided to deploy short-range and middle-range missiles all over Eastern Europe. That was at the time where the saying was, the shorter the range of the missiles, the deader the Germans. I mean, that was a threat to Germany, that was a threat to Central Europe. And it was the Social Democratic government under Chancellor Helmut Schmidt who at that time, they decided we will defend our system, we will defend our liberties, we will not go away. And it was the NATO double-track decision which said either Russia is withdrawing their missiles or Europe is deploying its own missiles in Europe so in order to keep the balance. That was a very difficult situation, end of the 70s. There were peace discussions all over Europe, and it was this decision of NATO, which was supported by Germany and the other NATO states, to defend the value of the free West, which showed the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries that the West was not giving in, but was prepared to defend its values. And some of you perhaps remember the War of the Falkland Islands, where an island 5,000 miles away from Great Britain, with 4,000 kelpers, settlers and sheep, were occupied by Argentina, and where Margaret Thatcher decided, no, we will defend our values, and they sent the fleet over 5,000 miles without the logistics of Ronald Reagan and the NATO. They could never have managed, but they took the Falklands back. And that was, like the NATO double-track decision, a clear signal. We have our values, we have our democracy, we have our system where the people decide where they want to be, and not governments and not dictators. And this was a further decisive reason why communism realized they could not win on the military field, because that was also the time where Ronald Reagan invented the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which never was, it was a bluff, more or less, as we see it today. But at the time, it was credible that NATO and the Americans would have a system where they could protect the West against all the missiles from the East. And that was so expensive that the East could not develop a counter system. So at that time, it was very important. The West showed it was ready to defend its values, it had the means to defend them, and it had also an economic system which was more effective than all the competitors on the field of non-democracy. So, what can we learn from this? Of course, it's the people, but the people on the basis of credible democratic values, an economic system which does not unilaterally concentrate the wealth on one side, but where the wealth is spread in a just manner over the population, where there is a system of social security, where the environment is protected. That is the European model of economy. And when you have that this model is superior to all the others, freedom, economic superiority, and the readiness to defend your values, that is not a guarantee, but that is, I think, the best way to defend a country's freedoms, a continent's freedoms, and to bring down walls and iron curtains and all the other installations which are made to suppress people. That is what the essence of my experience, and I hope you will see in your life freedom, readiness to defend freedom, and economic progress. You will see that also in your life.